Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 20th of June, or I suppose the 13th of June as well, 2022. Andy and I have been working on this week's Watching Brief for the past couple of weeks. We were waiting on some crucial information, then other things came to light, and you'll hear about it in a moment. But nonetheless, our Watching Brief, despite a delay, does continue, and I'm happy to say that I am joined by my colleague, Mr. Andy Brockman. How are you doing, Andy?
Fine, we're waiting for the British summer to end in Sturm and Drang down here in London. It's very muggy, and we've got thunderstorms forecast for later. So great fun.
A nice break to the heat. Yeah, it's funny. It's that time of year when I complain about the heat on Archaeosoup social media. You get people living in deserts saying that's not hot. 28 degrees, 34 degrees. I think we had the other day, for example. And hotter, obviously, you know, actually in the sun as opposed to in the shade. But it's not the heat; it's the humidity that gets you. It's the humidity, man, that kills you. Yeah. So I've got a fan over there. It is blowing on me. If you can hear it at all on the mic, I don't think you can, but if you can, apologies, folks. But I'll be melting unless I had that that in the background. Anyway, our Watching Brief continues, regardless of the heat, regardless of delays, regardless of due diligence. And speaking of due diligence...
No, definitely incorporated due diligence, as our viewer is about to discover.
Exactly. Speaking of due diligence, we are revisiting the previous episode of Watching Brief, not last week's, the weeks before, by embracing a request to own, inverted commas, the direction of travel that we took in that previous episode. We were discussing, if you recall, an instance of the press attacking academics. This is something which is becoming increasingly common in this country, and particularly archaeology and archaeologists. When it made it onto the front page, it was something that simply had to be talked about, I have to say. And we did our best to talk about it in a way that didn't drag the member of staff at York into it, in so much as we didn't name the individual. We didn't go any further than we felt we had to in order to address the issues. But we went in that direction partly because of, well, I'd say probably a comms cock-up, wouldn't you, Andy?
What happened was that when we did our due diligence, obviously, if we're going to mention an organisation or a body or a person, and particularly if we're going to criticise them, then ethically we have to give them a right reply. And so before we talked about
whether they reply or indeed block you because apparently you're harassing them for asking for a right of reply, that's a whole other issue. But anyway, go ahead.
That's people's own decisions. Journalistically, ethically, we have to offer a right to comment and reply. Which we did. And we contacted 3 senior bodies in UK archaeology to ask what they felt about the stories that were running about the communicating archaeology course at York in the Daily Mail and in the Star particularly, where people might remember the I Want My Mummy front page that the Star ran that we showed last time. We got one reply back which suggested that this particular body, the CBA, and the communications office at media office at York had agreed not to comment, to quotes, protect the individual concerned. At that time, we did not know that the individual concerned had consented to that strategy.
Well, or indeed had implemented the strategy. It sounds as though she specifically requested that the press office at York in particular didn't.
Yeah, I mean, the way these things work, the press office could have overridden that if they wanted to, or have imposed a strategy on the academic concerned. The point was really, it was if people felt we were stepping out of order, particularly in the light of a subsequent blog post, which made clear
an excellent blog post.
An excellent blog post, very thought-provoking blog post. I take issue with some of the things in it, but it was a very thought-provoking blog post by Professor Colin Morgan. In fact, we can, as it's in the public domain, we can say that now.
And link below.
Had the comms office said we have agreed this strategy with her consent, in fact, or even at her suggestion, so off the record, that's what we're doing. we could have checked with her that was actually the case, that they weren't just spinning us a line. And had that been confirmed, we would have approached the story entirely differently. Basically, by not telling us that what they were doing was with her agency, they left the space for us to draw the conclusion that we did, that there'd basically been a case of possible corporate cowardice in terms of defending their staff.
But actually, I just go one small step further. I don't want to drag this on, but one small step further and say we weren't just left in with a void. Someone filled that void from the CBA and said, we are doing this to protect this person involved. So we were basically told this and left to presume that this had been done post hoc, on the fly, and that silence was apparently protection. So in that sense, we make no apologies for discussing the issues at hand. I think more people should be talking about how the press interacts with academia, and in particular archaeology at the moment. So, of course, we'll be linking to Colleen's blog post below. And actually, when it was published, I went back and put that link in below the previous episode of Watching Brief as well. Well worth a read, and see what you think. Come to your own conclusions on the issue. It is difficult, though, when to use the old archaeological adage, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This is true. But at the same time, one can't presume that silence involves agency. We've seen far too many cases where people have essentially been told to shut up by press offices and management and so on and so forth, for fear of embarrassing their home institution, that without any other information, and indeed with a contrary narrative provided to us, you can see how it's difficult to report accurately on events, particularly when these issues are so important to talk about. We should talk about how the press interacts with academia. It's important, particularly when it involves our beloved sector of archaeology.
And I would say as well, and it's where I would take issue with Professor Morgan's blog, I think that the sector, the archaeologists, have to push back on this kind of deliberate misrepresentation and misinformation. Because if archaeologists don't, then the only record that's left out there on social media, on websites and so on, is the attack, not the defense. And journalists writing stories to tight deadline, research using Google. End of.
And journalists researching Google influence public opinion, which influences, broadly speaking, public funding and so on and so forth. So yeah, narratives need to be involved. Okay, right. Well, all of that is good. Check out the blog post, and I'm glad to have cleared that up somewhat. Next, though, we have a quick newsline and update on a tunnel infilling project in Cumbria that Andy brought to my attention a couple of episodes ago, where this is a headline in The Guardian. Supposedly, national highways have been forced to remove 1,644 tons of gravel and concrete infilling. This Victorian bridge in Cumbria must be reversed, says the council, and seemingly at great cost. Now, obviously, you highlighted this as an issue, or rather, you spotted other people also discussing this as an issue before I noticed it. Is this a good move? Direction of travel? Do you think?
Well, let's let our viewer decide. Basically, the story so far: Eden District Council were holding a planning hearing into the infilling of a Victorian railway bridge by National Highways, which is the government's arm's length body that builds and maintains Britain's road infrastructure, major road infrastructure. The bridge concerned at Great Musgrave was infilled with concrete and gravel, allegedly, National Highways said, because it wasn't safe. But they did it without planning permission. This was picked up by the Historic Railways Estate Group, who are a campaigning group who campaign for the maintenance of historic railway bridges and routes so that they can be enjoyed as heritage artifacts, but also as pathways, potentially as cycle paths, potentially even reopened as railways. So the HRE group challenged what had happened. It went to planning at Eden District Council, And in spite of National Highways offering what was described in quotes as a sweetener to pay for, again, nearly £500,000 to support other historic Victorian railway infrastructure in the area if they were allowed to keep the infill of the Great Musgrave Bridge. They were sent away with a flea in their ear. The permission was denied, retrospective permission was denied, and they now are looking at a bill of about £250,000 roundabout to remove the infill that they put in without permission. Obviously, the campaigning group are delighted, but they also say that it highlights a problem with this kind of historic railway heritage in that it's treated as often as a local issue, a local planning issue, rather than an issue of national heritage. That really National Highways, they're not a heritage body. Coincidentally, accidentally, they're responsible for this stuff because roads run over the old railways, and that's what these bridges are by and large. And it is cheaper for them, it is argued by the cynics, to infill a Victorian bridge than maintain it, even though the bridge might actually be perfectly safe, at least for now. So this situation appears to have been sorted out, but I know certainly HRE, the group that basically brought this about and brought this result to be, they are looking for the next one, I think. So they're not going anywhere.
No. Now, funnily enough, actually, we're going to be talking about a fluke of administration and care of heritage sites and or assets falling under a department that may not necessarily be the best one to handle those sites in a moment. This is maybe the focus of this watching brief, following what on the surface seems to be a very exciting archaeological discovery, but we'll come back to that in a moment. But before we do, we both need to take a moment just to talk to you a little bit about Patreon. Now the thing is, the I may be a Welshman and he's an Englishman, but we're both British, and we both cringe when it comes to talking about money. But ultimately, watching brief takes time. It's a weekly commitment, and even when it was a monthly commitment, it takes a lot of time behind the scenes, making the agenda, researching independent news stories that we are putting together, and in this case, this particular watching brief contains, well, you were saying approximately 10 years worth of observing archaeology, in a particular in a particular set of circumstances, which can't be underestimated. We are living through a cost of living crisis. But even if we weren't, and even if money wasn't tight, I think we both need to be more forwards as opposed to quite so backwards in going forwards when it comes to acknowledging the time, effort, and therefore the cost that goes into producing watching briefs. Now, we're not threatening to cease necessarily, but it'd be wonderful if you guys benefit at all from our ramblings. If you enjoy these conversations and if you look forward to them, I know quite a few people who do, seemingly in the comments and in other places who've commented and complimented us, then now would be a wonderful time for you to consider supporting our work. At the moment, the Archaeosoup Patreon has a particular tier which is specifically for watching brief. And if you any money that goes towards that, as little as $1 per month, will be divvied up between Andy and I to support this work. But also as well, we are about to finally have that long-standing conversation about our offering as well. So we're thinking about merch. We're thinking about other benefits that you might be able to get for supporting Watching Brief. That'll be coming soon. But I don't know. I mean, you've been very quiet there, Andy, letting me take the brunt of that very British embarrassment. So I mean, what do you think? How do you feel about this?
All I would say is that independent thought, independent journalism about archaeology costs.
Yeah.
And so if anyone out there thinks that what we do, what we say, the contribution we make is important enough for you to give your time to, then any support that you can give us to make sure we'll be here next week, next month, and telling the stories that need to be said. Because, as is often said about certain kinds of journalism, the news is what somebody doesn't want to hear. Everything else is just advertising.
That's one of your favourite go-tos. Who said that, by the way?
It's apocryphal, actually. Nobody quite knows.
Okay,
but it's been around. It's been around since at least the beginning of the 20th century, apparently, in various forms.
Yeah, it is true. It is true. And with that in mind, thank you for your consideration. Links below. Do check them out if you're interested. We would very much appreciate your support. But we're going to go on to what is now decidedly not mere advertising in discussing maritime archaeology. There have been quite a few archaeological stories hitting the news in the past fortnight or so from the maritime archaeological world. It seems to be the season for maritime archaeology, which I've never really noticed quite so much as I have this year. But for example, a few weeks ago, a few months ago, in fact, we heard of the Endurance, the shipwreck that was left in Antarctica by Shackleton's expedition, being not so much discovered, but I suppose accurately located by a team which was led by an archaeologist from, you were saying, from the Falklands, was it?
That's right. He's originally from the Falkland Islands, Menson Bound, who's been working on various high-profile projects for many years now. But the Endurance is the latest. You might have heard him a few years ago. He was involved in the location of the German cruiser Scharnhorst and Gneisenau off the coast of the Falklands from the Battle of the Falklands in 1914. This is a successor project to that, and it involves an organisation called the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust.
Yes,
and others. But basically what's happened is that the wreck of the Endurance, which was the ship that used by Sir Ernest Shackleton for his expedition to the Antarctic, actually while the First World War was still going on. And in 1915, it was caught in ice in the Weddell Sea and was abandoned by Shackleton, who famously brought all his crew out to safety. But the ship was lost, and the ship's location was lost. But earlier on this year, it was found by Menson Bound and his team using deep water ROVs. Endurance is actually in 3,000 meters of water in the Weddell Sea. And the latest installment in the story really is that because the Weddell Sea is basically it's in international waters, it's covered by the member states of the Antarctic Treaty. And the Antarctic Treaty has declared a 500-meter perimeter around the wreck site of Endurance to protect it from being predated by other expeditions with maybe less good intentions. And it's more to make the point, actually, it's a historic monument. It's unlikely to be reached certainly anytime soon because it's, as I say, it's 3,000 meters down in the Antarctic. It's a very difficult site to reach. But with climate change, with deep sea technologies, there's always a possibility that sites become more vulnerable than they are at the moment. And this is a case of getting the protection in first on an international basis, and I think to be applauded.
Well, absolutely. And in that sense, it feels as though this is an international collaboration. Incidentally, some wonderful photos of the wreck as well on the story. But in comparison with the other two examples that we're looking at, and we'll be linking to other stories from the maritime archaeological world as well below, just to sort of pepper in the theme, really, because it has been a heck of a couple of weeks. Sorry for that, a couple of months. But in this instance, we have a shipwreck which is arguably being protected because there's international consensus largely due to its fame. It's a famous shipwreck. It's a famous expedition. There are hundreds of thousands of shipwrecks around the world that don't necessarily benefit from this sort of protection. Now, the other story that we're looking at, and all of this is sort of laying groundwork and building up a theme here, is in Norway. The Viking Ship Museum is currently closed. When you go to the website and when you look into visiting it, it's actually set to be closed until 2026 as it stands. As after 95 years in operation, the home of the Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship, and the Tuna Viking ship is being they're building a new home for these ships in what will become a museum of Viking life as opposed to the Viking Ship Museum. And this has been interesting because this is a single nation and its responsibility to look after maritime heritage, which has been highlighted as potentially problematic as 2 months before construction was set to begin on the new buildings for these to house these maritime archaeological treasures. There's been a problem. The project has been placed on hold due to demands from government that it adheres to the original budget for the buildings, as opposed to taking into account delay and post-pandemic costs, material costs rising, and also as well the ongoing care of these artifacts. This has led some to speculate, and indeed a Change.org petition was started by Mary Andmundsen, who said that the response to this particular petition was truly astonishing, gaining so far 19,535 signatures, in order to make sure that there isn't a lack of the momentum doesn't cease in this project, because at the moment there's a very real possibility that all of this material, which has been packed away, the displays have been taken down, they were ready to start building the new museum, that this stuff may never come out of storage if the budget isn't found, if the funds aren't forthcoming to make sure that the new museum goes ahead. Now, I suppose in this instance, if we relate it to the Endurance, should these internationally significant wrecks be subject to sort of supranational funding and availability to the public, or is this potentially another case of the fame of the ships leading to people being particularly concerned about them, when actually maybe they're not necessarily at risk of disappearing forever? What do you think?
Well, look, let's compare the two first of all, and then we've got a third example which we're going to come to in a minute. The Endurance project is being run by a private organisation called the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust, and it has had to fundraise. It involved the South African registered icebreaker to find the wreck. At the moment, they're not talking about raising anything. They might do in the future, but then they'd have to get through all sorts of jump through various hoops, like, for example, the UNESCO rules on underwater cultural heritage and so on. And obviously, it's covered by the Antarctic Treaty. So you've got private organisations and public bodies and governmental bodies interacting, basically, with a heritage object at the core of the interaction.
And also, crucially,
in Norway,
it doesn't necessarily cost money to say that there's a 500-metre perimeter, as it were.
No, you've got marginal costs of the work, the time of the officials in setting all that up and making the statements and so on and so on and so on. But you're not investing. And maritime archaeology, underwater archaeology, is notoriously expensive, and that's even before you've got people who set out to try and make money from it. Now, there's no suggestion that that's happening in the case of the Endurance.
No.
But other well-known companies, Policy Marine Exploration, have tried that model, and very controversially. So funding maritime archaeology is difficult. Everybody acknowledges that. In Norway, big difference. First of all, it's on land.
Yes.
Secondly, it's within a single political jurisdiction, that of the government of Norway.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a project that is being run, at least designed by the Oslo University, but it's being funded by the Norwegian government. And one of the reasons it's being funded by the Norwegian government is, as well as the fact that the Viking ships of the Viking Age, are iconic internationally as an emblem of Scandinavia, and perhaps, the Gokstad ship, the Oseberg ship of Norway in particular. There's I hate to use the word nationalistic element, but certainly an element of national pride going on here. At the same time, it's also everybody is caught up in the cost of living crisis, and that is what lies at the root of the current row. But balancing that out, is this new museum an investment in the tourist offer for Oslo in particular and Norway in general? Which it absolutely is, of course. One of the main heritage sites that tourists and local people would visit in the Oslo area would be the Viking ships, the preserved Viking ships.
Well, I mean, frankly, we a couple of years ago we were going to go and visit Liv, a colleague, sometimes on Archaeosoup, in Sweden, and she was going to meet us in Norway so we could go to the museum together. She's actually getting married. We were going to go to the museum next year, but no, we probably can't. So because it's not going to be open. The new one won't be open until 2026 at the moment. But is that a factor here whereby it is nonetheless important to keep an eye on making sure that the wheels keep moving on this, and they don't just say, "Oh well, the ships are safe for now. Let's just leave them in the shed," or I mean, in controlled, carefully monitored conditions.
Except that an article that we've referenced in the below the line here that our viewers can look at, sciencenorway.no, it's here in English actually, so which is how I'm able to reference it. But there is a suggestion, for example, that the Gokstad ship has been deteriorating over the last period of time. The archaeologist Marie Amundsen is quoted as saying that she noticed cracks in the Gokstad ship, fresh cracks in the Gokstad ship 10 years ago, and that those cracks have only got bigger. And then she's quoted again as saying, "I've visited the museum every year since, and the cracks have just gotten bigger and bigger until the last time I went, a week before they started packing the items away in preparation for the new museum. This time it was a gaping hole." Now, that is coming up against the suggestion that the Norwegian government have made, that the new museum, which they had funded and promised to fund, because of an estimated cost overrun, has to be reconfigured by the museum of by the University of Oslo, which is running the project, has to be reconfigured to fit the original budget. And the minister involved has stated that if that means going back to square one and redesigning something from the bottom up, so be it, with all the delays that entails.
And so what we have there is the Gokstad ship in particular is arguably on display. At the very least, it was being constantly monitored by human eyes. They could actually see what was going on. If it's going into storage, then these sort of problems may continue, and that sort of constant monitoring may be less easy to do. And so you can see why there's a question over the urgency in keeping the ball rolling and building the new building. But here we have then a single, as you say, a national jurisdiction, a museum and a government negotiating within their own country about looking after this ship. So that's our second case study, and this is where we come to, I suppose, our third. And this is something that, as I say, Andy hinted at before. Andy's been keeping an eye on, broadly speaking, in one way or another for a decade, apparently. You wouldn't think so. He's not that old. He doesn't look that old, does he? But anyway, whereby actually recently a shipwreck came to prominence in Britain, the Gloucester. And on the face of it, this seems like amazing news, a new shipwreck, a royal shipwreck connected to the story of King James. and that, there's been lots of talk about potentially the future of Britain having altered irrevocably if certain people had died on board the ship when it went down. But where does this story actually begin, and why are we talking about it? In other words, why is this particular story actually worthwhile supporting on Patreon?
We're talking about it because on June the 10th, the University of East Anglia masterminded a press launch for the Gloucester project, the public face of the Gloucester project. Because the university, along with Norfolk Museum Service, with service providers like York Archaeology, York Archaeological Trust, I should say, and so on, have put together a project based on the research to do with the shipwreck of HMS Gloucester, which was a 50-gun frigate, the Speaker-class frigate. It was built by the under the period of the Cromwellian Republic, and then became a Royal Navy warship when the Royal Navy was reinstituted after the Restoration in 1660. In May 1682, she was carrying James, Duke of York, and members of his household, including John Churchill, who later became the Duke of Marlborough and is the ancestor of Sir Winston Churchill, probably our most famous Prime Minister, on an embassy to Scotland, which, of course, at that time was still, there were separate crowns of England and Scotland, but held by the king who was crowned in London, had been since their grandfather James II, James VI of Scotland, came south on the death of Elizabeth I. So there's Stuart politics, high Stuart politics in play at the time, because James was heading to Scotland to bring back his wife, who was currently pregnant, so that the child could be born in England.
Okay.
So it was carrying members of the English and Scottish aristocracy, their households, as well as the regular crew and officers. Basically, off the coast of Norfolk, there was a row between the ship's pilot, other senior officers, and James, Duke of York, who overruled the pilot over what course they should take. James was the High Admiral of England at the time as well, and quite an experienced seafarer, it has to be fair. Anyway, cut to the chase. In the early hours of the morning, the ship ran aground. It immediately started leaking, and within about half an hour or so was washed off the sandbank where she was sitting, and sank in about 30 meters of water. Around about 150, possibly more, people were killed in the wreck. James escaped with, one of the chroniclers records acidly, with his pugs, his priests, and I think it was his treasure, in the ship's main boat, with, again, members of his household, and apparently one of his friends holding back other people, including members of the crew, at sword point while they escaped the wreck.
Right.
He did not get a good press out of it, it has to be said.
No.
But historically, this is important, and this point is made by the University of East Anglia. Had James been drowned, there would have been no James II, there would have been no Glorious Revolution, there would have been no probably Bill of Rights. We've heard a lot about that in the last week.
Yeah.
And if John Churchill had been drowned, there would have been no Sir Winston Churchill in World War II. Now, okay, other things would have happened. Other historical timelines would have opened up. It would have been like an episode of Star Trek. Which series, which timeline are we in? And historical what ifs are fascinating, but in the end, they're futile.
Yeah.
What we've got actually is an important historic shipwreck of a working, regular working, unspectacular ship of the Royal Navy of the period that went down. It happened to go down carrying some quite important people, and perhaps a larger cross section of Stuart society, Restoration society, than would have been otherwise the case. But it's an important wreck site, and there is no question about that.
And so a little bit like the Endurance, was its location broadly known but not confirmed?
Right. Now, the the location was known broadly from the time the accident happened.
Yeah,
it was covered in contemporary accounts. There was a court martial.
I mean, there's a painting
of the ship's pilot. Yeah, the ship's pilot was court-martialed and actually spent a year in the Marshalsea prison, even though the accident was probably not his fault.
Interesting. Okay. Mm-hmm.
It's a case of junior heads will roll. And the location, roughly 30 miles off what's Great Yarmouth, in an area that's called the Ower Bank, OWER Bank, was broadly speaking known. The ship appeared in gazetteers of shipwrecks for the diving community and for historians, and there are many historical descriptions, even paintings of the accident. It was a major cultural moment. And cut to the chase, it would appear in round about 2004, 2005, a family of hobby wreck divers called the Barnwells went looking for the ship, along with others. Now, the University of East Anglia and presented it to the media as a plucky Brit divers follow a dream and find the shipwreck. In fact, shall we say, it's more complicated than that. That's all I can say at the moment. And by 2010, and to period 2010 to 2012, when I first started looking at it, the situation with the Gloucester was thoroughly mixed up with the situation of HMS Victory 1744, the ship that sank in the western approaches of the English Channel in October 1744, which had been located by Odyssey Marine Exploration, and they were trying to get access to salvage.
Right.
Now, both those ships, being ex-Royal Navy warships, being Royal Navy warships, there's nothing ex about it, being Royal Navy warships, come under the purview of the British government, and in particular the British Ministry of Defence, and within the British Ministry of Defence, an organisation called Navy Command, which is based down in Portsmouth. They handle the sort of heritage end of the Royal Navy, as well as many, many other things. They're not a heritage body.
No, yeah. So in that way, it's similar to the story about highways administration being responsible for old railway bridges. It's sort of
exactly that. Heritage warships and heritage bridges are legacy responsibilities for the organisations that government has running nowadays. So Department for Transport, with its arm's length organisation, National Highways, is responsible for the historic railway infrastructure. Historic Royal Navy warships still come under the purview of the Ministry of Defence, and not, for example, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which handles other heritage issues with its statutory advisor, Historic England. So, to cut to the chase, the Victory saga ended up in the courts, and in fact, as things stand at the moment, a judicial review upheld the decision of the Marine Management Organisation to refuse a licence for the salvage of HMS Victory. And it's too complicated to go into now, but basically, it was trying to reassert control over the managers of the wreck, who had the wreck gifted to them ultimately by the Ministry of Defence. Effectively, the Ministry of Defence outsourced the management of HMS Victory. Without thinking it through, it would appear.
So just for the folks at home, and also for me, just to remind me, are these ships, if people went down with these ships, or if they were part of the Royal Navy at some point, are they in a similar sort of category to war graves in France, for example?
The short answer is no, and this is something that I have to explain to people quite often. Although the Geneva Conventions cover, for example, the treatment of war dead on land, they do not extend to the war dead at sea. Other international provisions do cover military wrecks at sea. So, for example, the UN Salvage Convention, which is incorporated into UK law under the Merchant Shipping Act, brain to mouth, basically says that you can't recover material from a warship without the express consent of the government. That's what the row was about. When we covered the story of, for example, of the Dutch company that was looting metal from HMS Queen Mary, Jutland wreck, in 2016, the reason that was an issue was because the Royal Navy and the British government had never surrendered ownership of that wreck. They'd never outsourced it. They'd never sold it to a scrappy. The Dutch company concerned was lifting the material absolutely without permission, which means under international law they could not claim a salvage reward. And what they were doing was actually effectively acting unlawfully.
So it's a bit messy. Sorry, so it's all of these things are a bit messy, and lots of different laws and international things sort of apply. Yeah. How does this bring us back to the Gloucester, and where might we see this story going? I'm trying to choose my words very carefully because, as you say, we don't want to talk about stuff that's not yet legally nailed down. But it's an interesting quandary, isn't it?
Put it this way: the arguments in Britain about the treatment of historic wrecks, focusing on Victory and Gloucester in particular, but also other possibilities have been mentioned and drawn into this on the periphery. The argument is about how are these wrecks financed, how is archaeological work, recovery work, salvage work, whatever you want to call it, on these wrecks financed, and how is it undertaken in accord with the rules of the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, which was created in 2002. Britain isn't a fully signed up signatory, but does acknowledge the rules of the convention as its policy for underwater archaeology. And amongst other things, those rules state that before you start a project, it has to be fully funded. You have to have an end user archive nominated, so you're not just pulling stuff up willy-nilly without knowing where it's going to end up, without it being properly conserved and so on. And in particular, you have to keep an entire archaeological archive together, and you are not allowed to sell finds to finance the work.
Yeah. Or disperse that collection. Yeah.
You can't disperse the collection, absolutely. Now, one of the arguments around HMS Victory was that Odyssey were lobbying to have the British government basically depart from the UNESCO rules by allowing what Odyssey often called trade goods, so things that have duplicates like bottles and coins, to allow those to be sold after they were archaeologically recorded. And that was obviously extremely controversial. There was a lot of pushback, including questions in Parliament, parliamentary committees, and so on, which eventually ended up with, say, the work on the Victory being blocked. The work on the Gloucester, however, appears to have continued, and that's where the story is likely to go in future. Precisely what happened, who said what, when, and what the fallout is now with the new project that's just been announced by the University of East Anglia. Now, I'm going to say, we're not suggesting anybody's done anything illegal. No. But I think the suggestion is at the moment it could turn into one hell of a mess, like the Victory did.
And this and in particular, there's also a question here as well as to who is interpreting what rules how as well. But again, we can't say anything else just yet on that. But that's an interesting question across the board there. But expanding this out, therefore, and coming back to endurance, are we at risk with this sort of a mess that can very easily surround shipwrecks, of being in a situation where, for example, given that ships don't technically have the same protections and standards as war graves, even though common sense, the public may well presume that to be the case, and they're in that sense that I think they're allowed to presume that's the case, especially when it comes to war dead. Are we in a problematic situation whereby only famous shipwrecks will get adequate protection, potentially, if we're not careful? Because if a shipwreck is attached to a historic happening that everyone knows, or a person that people can point to, a painting of, or an event that lives in the cultural memory, then, for example, Gloucester, one would presume people are going to be looking at it and keeping an eye on it, and while they can tell the story and get, for example, the Mary Rose Museum to comment on the project, then there'll be eyes on. Whereas if this wasn't the Gloucester, like 100 metres away, and it's a different shipwreck, are we at risk of the laws being interpreted in an entirely different way because of these flukes of administration, international law intersecting, and also a lack of definition when it comes to things like war graves at sea?
The short answer is yes. That particular area of the North Sea was heavily fought over in the Anglo-Dutch Wars in the 17th century, in which, in fact, Gloucester took part. She took part in several of the battles in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. There are known wrecks in the area which are yet to be fully announced and remain unidentified, some of which may even be Dutch government property, because there may be Dutch warships. This is we're dealing with an area of cutting edge maritime archaeology, because until relatively recently, a lot of these sites weren't located and weren't locatable.
No,
it's thanks to things like undersea pipelines, undersea cables, particularly wind farms, where a lot of survey work has been done. People might be familiar with Doggerland.
Yeah.
The work that's led to the understanding of the Mesolithic landscape underneath the North Sea, that still survives underneath the North Sea, that was flooded in the period sort of 12,000 to 7,000 BCE.
I think the peak flooding event was around 5,000 BCE.
Yeah.
But anyway, just 2,000 years.
And a lot of the work that has led to an understanding of Doggerland and what it looked like has come from the petrochemicals, the offshore petrochemicals industry.
And
subsequently,
also deep sea fishing as well, dredging.
Dredging, yes, and again, dredging is an acknowledged threat to wrecks, although by and large, trawlers, skippers try and avoid known wrecks because they use their nets. So it's these are complex issues, and they're complex issues of international jurisdiction, not just about archaeology. I mean, look at the rows that the government of the UK is involved with at the moment regarding fishing since leaving the EU. We're recording this on the 6th anniversary of the result being announced. And there are many issues that are still to be decided. So when it comes to issues like the Gloucester, then are we suggesting that a question has to be asked over whether it's a good idea to have a body who's at the moment, for example, trying to find supply routes to get weaponry into Ukraine to help fight against Russian invasion, that administrative body doesn't necessarily have to deal with shipwrecks of various backgrounds and degrees of preservation and apparent historical or cultural importance? I've been looking at this material really since 2012, and since I've been talking to a lot of people. I've looked at a lot of documents released under the Freedom of Information Act, and it is pretty clear that the situation would be very different had it been run by heritage professionals and not civil servants who are trying to do the best for their government and their minister as they see it. There are a number of occasions in the record, over Victory and elsewhere, where organisations like Historic England, English Heritage as it was when I first started looking at this, the government statutory advisor on maritime archaeology and heritage matters, and people in the museum community. The National Museum of the Royal Navy is another player in this, which is it's supported by the Ministry of Defence as the national collection of Royal Navy artifacts and archive down in Portsmouth. People, it's been in the news again recently because they've opened an exhibit with a D-Day landing ship tank, landing craft rather tank.
Right.
As part of its, which has been preserved, and they have other preserved ships down there as well as they hosted or now host the ship's bell of HMS Hood that was lifted by David Mearns some years ago now. with permission, it has to be said. So the National Museum of the Royal Navy has been involved in this too, as the likely ultimate destination for the principal archive of government Royal Navy artifacts from these ships.
Yeah.
And they have been invoking things like the UNESCO rules and the Museums Association Code and things like that to basically tell the MOD, you can't just let people run with this. There was one occasion, for example, when a draft memorandum of understanding that was being sent out to one of the salvage companies, organisations, had a paragraph in it that allowed for the sale of artefacts.
Right.
And Historic England and so jumped on this really quickly and said, no, you just cannot include that. That breaks the UNESCO rules, which are government policy. So, you know, whether it was just somebody not doing the due diligence or whether that, you know, hadn't checked with the lawyers or what, but, you know, something that should never have got even into a draft had to be picked up in the checking.
And as you say, that's the difference between a generalised sort of civil servant approach and a specialist approach. But to flip that on its head, then, as a final question, this is entirely hypothetical, folks. Again, we're not saying anyone's done anything illegal or is planning on doing anything illegal. No. But if a project got through the gates that did have a provision for the partition of goods on the site, artifacts, whether they're deemed to be mass produced or not, and sold off in order to, whether it's even, you know, deemed to be not for profit, paying for what's happening on the site or what, sale of artifacts from a wreck. If that got through, what is there at the moment to stop that being a precedent that essentially means that the other wrecks are at similar risk? I mean, would that just be seen as a mistake and then you'd fall back on the UNESCO rules, or would there be an argument then that people could go to court with?
Certainly, it would probably end up in a legal argument, probably in something like a judicial review, where the salvage company would ask the judge if that action by a department of the British government acted as a precedent and was effectively permission and was effectively rewriting the rules.
Yeah.
Now, to give you an example of how complicated this stuff can be, because Gloucester was carrying Royal Navy personnel and was a Royal Navy ship, but was also carrying private citizens. Anything that's government issue remains the property of the government.
Yeah.
Anything that is shown to be it cannot be shown to be the property of the government comes under different salvage conventions and laws. So, for example, anybody pulling up, say for example, you pull up a chest that contains a late 17th century, 1680s rather, military frock coat. Now, there were a number of military...
I thought you were going to say tea set. Damn it. I had a little mental bet going on. Okay, frock coat. Go on.
A frock coat wrapping up a tea set.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, unless that frock coat has got a name tag in it or a coat of arms, and unless that tea set has a coat of arms or a name scratched on it or whatever...
Yeah.
Who actually owns that? The receiver of wreck, to whom all material has to be declared, has a duty within a year to try and trace the ultimate beneficial owner, so that owner can then negotiate what's called a salvage reward with the salver.
And the receiver of wreck is
a government official.
So that's not MOD, that's government.
The current receiver. The receiver of wreck it's an old office, and the receiver of wreck is a government official and administers wreck material that's comes from the sea and is declared, and basically tries to find out who owns it.
Yeah.
If they can't find an owner, then it normally reverts to the salver.
Yeah.
And they and they can do what they like with it, because, you know, a complicating factor. Say, for example, that frock coat has, you know, the coat of arms or the name John Churchill in it. Then that would technically be the property of his descendants, the current Churchill family.
Yeah.
Who could then negotiate a salvage reward with the salver. You know, you can see how complicated this gets. Give you favorite example. There was a steamer, pedal steamer called the Central America that sank in a hurricane in the 1860s, carrying back people who'd been in the California gold rush. It had a lot of registered treasure on board, gold on board, and also it suspected people were carrying their own private stashes, bags of gold dust and things like that.
Yes.
It sank. It was found in the 1980s by a man called Tommy Thompson, who was one of the first people to go in for deep water salvage stroke archaeology with ROVs. When he lifted the material up, and then when subsequently he went on the run, being accused of having ripped off his investors, Odyssey Marine Exploration went in and inspected the rest of the wreck, lifted the stuff that Thompson's team had missed, and they did that on behalf of a court who were acting on behalf of the original owners and the descendants and the legal descendants of I think it was 19 separate insurance companies who had an interest in the original ship and passengers and its contents. So that's how complicated this stuff gets. It's still being sorted out in American courts.
Yeah. And the thing is, I feel as though, again, this is all hypotheticals, but this is very pertinent when it comes to, for example, Gloucester and other potential wrecks. There are little holes there where if a case got through, it would create a very compelling argument for a precedent being set. And ultimately, one of the issues here is, as you've relayed to me in the past, the story of you were having a conversation with a producer, a BBC producer, where you were trying to convince them. Well, was this about Victory? Was it? You trying to convince them as to why?
It was, yeah.
It was a story.
It was the time. It was, yeah. Basically, it was alleged by Odyssey that Victory was carrying a very large treasure cargo.
Yeah.
Now nobody else thinks that.
No.
But it was being said a lot at the time, and I was having lunch with, in fact, it was a senior BBC journalist who also produces reports for BBC News and so on at the time, and I was trying to explain why it was a bad idea that treasure hunters could just get let loose on a historic wreck, because the judgments they made would not be the ones that maximize archaeological value, but they'd be the ones that maximize the story of the
site. Yeah,
absolutely. But the person I was talking to said, if I was trying to convince a program editor that it was a treasure hunt story that maybe returns some money to the government as well if it was a Royal Navy ship like the Victory, why is that a bad thing?
Exactly. And that's precisely my point, is that this reminds me of that story in so much as all you need is a judge just to go, this is no bad thing, it's a win-win. The government coffers benefit, descendants benefit. Why are we having a discussion about this? Because it starts in a place which isn't, which has its own either distractions in the case of the MOD or a different set of criteria, i.e. things like value for taxpayer, etc., when it comes to civil servants.
That's right, and that's why the archaeological community, the mainstream archaeological community, certainly in England and in many cases around the world, and I've seen these arguments play out in Africa, in islands in the South Atlantic, in the Far East, and so on, that the UNESCO Convention and the UNESCO rules are so important because they prioritize archaeological value, and the issues around money are about ensuring that a project is properly funded, that the conservation's funded, and that the archive will be collected and kept together in a museum. That belongs in a museum, but the thing is, there has been and remains pushback from the salvage diver, the wreck diver community, who were certainly active before the UNESCO rules came in the early noughties, and commercial salvors who see it as cramping their style. But the idea being that any vessel over 100 years old, which is covered by the UNESCO rules, Endurance is covered by the UNESCO rules now as well. She sank in 1915, so she's been covered by the UNESCO Convention for 7 years now. That any historic vessel, the historic value is prioritized over any financial value. The problem is when you get situations like Central America, where you have a ship that technically would be covered by the UNESCO rules, but also there are commercial interests through those 19 descendant insurance companies. Square that circle.
Exactly. Now, I understand that there's likely more to follow, quite possibly.
This is a taster.
This is a taster, yeah. But we can't say much else. But there we are, folks, and it's this sort of question, it's this sort of analysis and comparison and research that does take time, and this is why we thought we'd just take that moment a little earlier on to mention Patreon. And we're going to have a way of reminding you that isn't quite so repetitive or on the nose every single. We're going to find a way of doing it just to sort of, as I say, be less backwards and going forwards. But
I had a vision flash through my mind there of, I'm old enough to remember Live Aid and the classic image of Bob Geldof staring down that camera's own camera going, "Give us your money."
Indeed, yeah, yeah. No, it's something less obvious than that, something a little less crass. I'm not even sure what next week's Watching Brief is going to be about. This one has been so long in the making, but I'm sure it'll be exciting. Thank you guys at home for watching. Please do comment below if you have any questions about the issues surrounding what we've been talking about today. For example, the Gloucester wreck, because on the one hand, it's been reported so positively, so unobstructively positively, that actually it was interesting seeing conversations unfold in various places on Twitter and other social media about the wreck as just being a done and dusted thing. And so it's interesting just to note that actually this is a minefield. And so if you have any questions, comment below, and I'm sure Andy will
it's something to be just very, very quickly, and it's maybe something we'll return to in future Watching Briefs, but and we didn't include it this week because of time. But there was also a big press release from HS2, high speed rail project, about a cemetery, a post-Roman cemetery, Saxon period cemetery at Wendover, which was all sorts of claims were made for, and it turns out that after the initial flurry of very positive coverage came, people were saying, "Wait a minute, that claim is a little bit over-egged," and that they say that's really special. Actually, it's not that special because it turns up regularly in cemeteries of that period and so on. So what I would always say is, whenever you read a press story about archaeology, always apply the who, what, when, where, why.
And this brings us neatly back around. Back around to the very beginning in that sense. It's all about the relationship between specialist, generalist, public, and academic. It's a heady mixture. Right, guys. Until next time. Do take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.